From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Our program today focuses on the 18th governor of Montana, Tom Judge, who was governor of Montana for 8 years of the period of change that we're talking about in this series. He was the youngest governor in the history of Montana and had a rather remarkable career in the period of change that we're talking about. Today, we're going to be focusing on the time before he was governor, the lead up to that governorship, because it's a very, very interesting story that points to some of the dynamics of the times. And we're joined by 3 special guests today. Larry Pettit. Larry was assistant to the governor, but also was his campaign manager in 1972 in the general election. Sidney Armstrong, who was involved in all of Tom's campaigns whenever they were run, all the way back to the first one in 1960, and Ken Kleinkopf, who was a campaign staffer in 1972 and later in the administration of Governor Judge. Now, these 3 people, with full disclosure, of course, are good friends. We've all remained friends for many, many years. Likewise, I want to make sure that everyone understands, and you as well, that I'm just not a moderator. This is a conversation. We all have something to contribute. You have wonderful things to contribute, but I may just jump in and throw something out, and you should feel free, just like we're sitting around the coffee table at home. And we want to share our experiences with the audience. Sid, you were a high school, I won't say classmate, but you attended high school when Tom did. And because of that, when he first decided to run for the legislature, I guess you were one of the first people he called. Tell us a little bit about that.
I didn't really get to know Tom so well in high school, though I looked up to him and admired him. Even at that time, he was very dynamic, he was very energetic, he was well-liked. I got to know him better when he was going to Notre Dame and would come home on Christmas vacations in the summer. So in 1960, when he came home and decided to run, he gave me a call and told me he was going to run. I'd never been involved in politics, wasn't very interested, frankly. And he asked if I would be the secretary of his Tom Judge for Legislature Club. I said, oh, Tom, well, you know, I would like to, but I don't even know how to type. He said, oh, for heaven's sakes, it isn't that kind of secretary. Your name will be on my campaign material. You know a lot of people in Helena, and we'd have a good time working on the campaign together. He was so busy working on the campaign himself, however, that I really never did anything till about 1964.
Now you were the person whose name was on the disclaimer.
Yes.
In every campaign.
Every single campaign.
That he ever ran.
Right.
That's remarkable consistency in terms of friendship and support. It's interesting to note that he was at such a young age running for the legislature. I mean, it was 1960, he was 26 years old.
And that was unusual in those days, certainly.
Yeah, I think he just turned 26 a month before the election. So when he was filing, he was 25 and just coming back to Montana, wasn't he?
Just coming back. He'd been at Notre Dame for college. He had worked in Louisville. He had been in Army Reserves for a time. I don't remember all the details, but it was when he was first coming back to Helena, going to open his own ad agency and going to settle in his hometown.
Now, Larry, you knew him at that time as well, because I think you were out here working the primary election for Senator Metcalf, although he was Congressman Metcalf at the time.
Right.
And there was an opening that was happening at that time in the Senate race?
Well, yes, I had been working for Senator Murray between graduate schools. And when the senator announced that he was going to retire, there was a little bit of jockeying to see who should replace him, and most of the party leaders thought it should be Lee Metcalf. Lee wasn't too eager to do it because he was becoming such a power in the House and probably would have ended up as Speaker had he stayed there. But Murray decided to support somebody else. And so I resigned from Murray's staff. I came back to work for Metcalf in the primary. I lived with Donna and Lee and Jerry in their house on 8th Street or 8th Avenue, whichever it is. And Tom was back from Kentucky, and he came to the house one night. He dropped by, and that's when I first met him, and we became good friends. And
I think it's important to note that there's a relationship between Lee Metcalf
Yes.
and Tom Judge,
Right.
that the Thomas L. Judge is Thomas Lee Judge, and his middle name, he is named after Lee Metcalf.
exactly, yes.
Their families were close.
Yeah, his father and Lee Metcalf were pretty close friends. Yeah, and both, as I understand it, both Sigma Chi's.
Yeah, so, but lo and behold, you
Yeah.
ran into a fairly dynamic young candidate
Oh,
in
yeah.
the middle of this thing you were doing on your own, helping Lee
And
Metcalf.
we became great friends, and then he had always had his eye on my girlfriend's younger sister, and wanted.
Did you
an
broker a
introduction.
relationship?
I think I did, and later Sherry and I were married, and then after that, Tom and Carol were married, and so we were brothers-in-law, and that became later on an issue with some
A
people.
couple of reflections about what type of person was this young guy that decided he was going to throw his hat in the ring? How would you describe him at that time?
He was one of the most interesting, most energetic, most dynamic, friendliest, warm, open,
Pretty good
outgoing.
guy, actually.
A very good guy, a very good guy.
Yeah.
And of course, Sherry, Larry's wife, Carol's older sister, was one of my best friends and my college roommate. He also was one of the few people in Helena at the time. There was a small coterie of skiers, and he was a terrific skier. And I remember he and two friends, Paul Jasmine and Clint Grimes, I think when they were seniors in high school, went to Sun Valley to ski and said they were college boys. That was always a favorite story
Scandalous.
of what they did then, yes.
Scandalous. Oh, he pretended we were college boys.
Exactly.
Yeah. So he was a dynamic candidate, and one of the things we talk about the empowerment of people, that is part of the period of change we're talking about. Although 1960 was slightly ahead of the curve on that, and he ran county-wide, he went to all the doors. Is that right?
Absolutely. Part of that was his kind of energy and interest and so forth. Part of it, I think, also was perhaps he didn't have all that much business quite yet. But it was quite new to go door to door like that, and not to be really invited so much by the County Central Committee and so on. Not that he wasn't friendly with them, but he was very independent even then, and did go door to door.
So he ran and won 3 consecutive House races.
Right.
I mean, was he kind of a surprise winning as a newcomer coming in like that in 1960, as you recall?
As I recall, yes, although everybody thought that young Judge boy was so nice.
Yeah.
And I remember people who said to me, well, I voted for him because he takes his mother to church and he passes the plate.
Aha.
So they thought he must be all right.
Now that brings up his mother, because his mother Blanche was a big part of his life. She was raising 2 sons. His dad had passed away, is that right?
That's correct. When he was going to Notre Dame, his father died in an accident. And Blanche opened a dance studio. She too was very dynamic, very high energy, and very devoted to the Democratic Party and principles. I feel Tom was really raised with that whole idea of we work together, we help people, we use the political system not to gain fame or money, but to do good things for people.
And then that was, of course, the year that JFK was elected.
Exactly. So there was a whole breadth of new, young, fresh people coming into office.
I know,
just beginning.
I know Governor Schwinden, in our discussions with him, talked about a lot of the change that came out of for the period that came out of World War II, the people who came back from World War II. But Tom was just about maybe 10 years beyond that, and he was
That's right.
almost a new generation that was not even out of World War II. And so there was a real freshness there. Now, when he decided to run for the Senate, 1966,
Right.
Do you remember that race? I mean, was it audacious to decide to be a senator? Did folks say, oh, this is something natural, or was it, hey, what's this up-and-coming guy doing?
No, I don't think it was so audacious. People had become interested and respectful of the hard work he did as a legislator. And once again, he worked very hard. He stayed later, he came earlier, and so forth and so on. It was also at a time when the Democratic Central Committee was getting very active, very involved. Voter registration, door to door, get out the vote, working with organized labor. And Lee Metcalf was running. It was a very exciting year in Montana.
Yeah, that was a big year. That was the year that Babcock, the sitting Republican governor, challenged Lee Metcalf for his seat. And that was quite a period of time. Now, also, I mean, there was a lot of national dynamic going on
Absolutely.
then. Vietnam War was probably still somewhat popular, but the divisions were starting to happen.
Definitely.
And people becoming energized on campus, women were becoming energized, a lot of interesting things going on at that time.
Absolutely. Civil rights, the Great Society, all kinds of federal programs beginning, things like Head Start and so forth. So yeah, it was a very exciting time.
Now, by the way, right about that time, he and Carol decided to tie the knot, didn't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we were thrilled. They were a wonderful young couple.
Tell us, she played in these campaigns through the 70s, through the 60s. She played a role in those. I mean, you look at those. That couple, it had to be very attractive. I mean, did she get right out there with him?
They were more than attractive. They were sort of like the Kennedys. They were glamorous. They were interesting. They were fresh. Carol was wonderful. She was a very private person. Campaigning was not her idea of a good time. And yet she was a warm and gracious person. And people loved to meet her. And oftentimes through all the campaigns, she and I would go out, say for a day together, or even a couple of days, just the two of us, have a 6-pack of Coke in the back seat. We'd take turns driving. We didn't have much money for a hamburger and a cup of coffee or something. But again, even though she was rather shy and private, as she met people, that warmth and graciousness came through, and people loved to see her. She was so genuine and so warm and friendly. And so we'd go, when everybody else went to the big cities and the rubber chicken, as they say, dinners, we'd get to go to places like Plains and Fort Benton and the smaller places where not only the people were thrilled to see somebody actually come and campaign, especially this lovely young woman, but the food was delicious as well.
That's one good thing about Montana. I like that.
Now, Evan, excuse me, I think genuine is the key term when you refer to Carol.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now, she was trained as a nurse?
She was an RN, yes, and had practiced as a nurse as well.
And so, and we won't deal with that in this program because this deals only up to the governorship, but that nurse's training and her interest in the policy of taking care of people showed up during the governorship in terms of what was her special project. Yeah.
It was at a time when the institutions were in absolute disarray. The conditions were horrifying. Most Montanans weren't aware of it. The people working at those institutions went on strike, and it was a real blessing, not even very well disguised, National Guard had to come in to take care of the residents at Warm Springs and Boulder, as I recall. And they went home throughout the state and said, these are the most horrible conditions we have ever seen. No one should have to live like that. Carol and Tom and I and others on staff went and visited the different institutions. And when we came back, Carol was determined to help convince the legislators and other Montanans that we had to do something about the institutions. So that is a wonderful story in itself. And then she became very involved with community-based services and the opening of group homes and so on. She played an enormously important role.
Now, it's obvious that this is a young couple who were dedicated to the way government could do good things for people.
Absolutely.
And I guess that, now by the way, with her being a nurse, we've neglected to point out when Tom came back from college and from the military, what did he do for a business? Because he had an interesting profession, didn't he?
He opened up his own ad agency, Judge Advertising, and he worked very hard at getting various accounts. The one I only, for some reason, remember is Montana Broadcasters Association. Maybe that's because I'm associated with the Greater Montana Foundation. In any event, so he had contracts with various associations. He did advertising for various organizations. One I remember, and I'm not sure if it was the state or if it was for Helena, he did a big poster that had a picture of a man with a bandana over his face, and it said, "Hold up a spell in Helena," and gave all the places you could stay. There was something he had looked into that said if you could get people to stay just one more day, it made a big difference in the economy of the town.
Mm-hmm. So, and when he was running a small advertising agency, was he probably like most small business people when the legislature happened and you happened to have to go serve for 60 days, the money didn't flow so well?
Oh, absolutely, and it certainly didn't, especially when he was campaigning for governor. Those weren't always very easy times, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, in 1966, he was in the Senate. He decided to run for lieutenant governor. Do you remember for 68, do you remember the genesis of that thinking and why he wanted to do it?
I think by that time it almost seemed like a natural progression. I've heard people say, well, of course he came back and he had his eye on the governorship, and that really wasn't true. And I don't remember, frankly, a whole lot of discussion about it. I just remember one day he said, I think I'm going to run for lieutenant governor. And of course, in those days, the governor and lieutenant governor did not run as a team, as they did later with the new Constitution. And as I recall, we all said, well, that would be great. Let's get after it.
So all of a sudden, he's running in a primary, and we'll talk a bit about that. Very competitive year in 1968.
Very.
Forrest Anderson had decided to run for governor, but he wasn't unopposed. Forrest had a lot of opposition with Eugene Mahoney and a number of other folks running against him. Leroy Anderson ran in that primary. And then, lo and behold, for lieutenant governor, it was like,
everybody in town ran.
Didn't it seem like that? I mean,
it did.
Who was running was
Fred Barrett.
Fred Barrett, who had been a former legislator for a number of years, about a decade, I believe, from Chester. And he was also the state Democratic Party chairman for a while, and then
Eddie Dusso.
Eddie Dusso, who was a state senator from Missoula and had been a state legislator from Missoula, and then a rather exuberant candidate from Billings.
Very colorful. Mike Kuchera and his polka band and his furniture store, yes.
Yeah, Mike Kuchera ran, and we kind of chuckled, but he put on a heck of a campaign.
He did.
He put on a heck of a campaign. But Tom seemed to me the one that perhaps was maybe least in favor of the party bosses, if there was such a thing.
I think that's true. It sort of wasn't his turn. You had Fred Barrett and Eddie Dusso, who'd sort of paid their dues. And Tom had not been all that involved with the party, per se, statewide. So when he campaigned, and he campaigned sometimes with other people who were more familiar, they went to see the people who were in the courthouse, the county attorney and so on. He went down the street into the cafes, stopped people on the corner and so on, and campaigned very much as a people-to-people kind of a candidate.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a way, that's part of the empowerment thing we talk about in this period, was that it was a time when there was movement away from the machinery that controlled government and politics, whether it be the internal machinery of the Democratic Party or the control of the economy and politics by the Anaconda Company and Montana Power. This was a challenge to that type of establishment. And all of a sudden, when the primary was over, he's the nominee by an overwhelming amount.
And we didn't expect it. Nobody expected it. He wasn't, they thought, that well known.
Now, again, thinking about full disclosure, that's where I first met you.
Absolutely.
You know,
one of the happiest days of my life, Evan.
I was teaching in Helena Junior High School. And to give you a sense of the nature of politics in those days, if you think about how automated and how everything is today, and with the internet and all the way of massive communication and all the technology that can be applied to politics, there was a great demand for people to sit around and hand fold letters and flyers. There weren't even folding machines available.
And hand stamp.
And hand stamp them, and lick them, and seal them, and so there was
and sort them.
And one of the things I did was I had a cadre of, I told all my students, you should get involved in the political campaigns and you get extra credit. And I said, now for all of you who want to work for any you work for Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter. And if you want to work for Republicans, here's the Republican headquarters address and phone number. And if you want to work for any of these Democrats, you can meet me at my apartment. So I had probably 3/4 of them decided they wanted to come to our place, but we would go down to the judge headquarters occasionally and sit there and fold 15,000 flyers in one sitting. That is what campaigning was about, really. But the candidate, of course, was in the forefront of it, meeting people.
Absolutely.
And let's talk for a second about, again, if you're not with the party establishment, Tom had a cadre of people around the state that he was linked up with, called the JCs.
He was very prominent with the JCs. He made great friends. It was the Junior Chamber of Commerce. We don't hear so much about them anymore, but they were very active and had a great deal of influence all across the state. They became so interested in this young leader that looked as though he were going to be a statewide candidate and elected. And so they helped form county organizations all over the state, and they campaigned with Tom. Meanwhile, Blanche, and there were no paid staff. Right. Blanche, essentially the mother, ran the campaign. And Blanche would call people that she remembered meeting at a dance conference in Spokane 2 years ago in Shelby. And she would call and ask them if they wouldn't work for her son and get them to organize. So along with a lot of Democrats who liked Tom, there were people who'd never been really involved politically. It was a new group of people becoming involved. They not only played such an important role in his campaign, but I'm happy to say many of them then became very involved in politics in general. And there is, I think, a great deal of an idealistic sense at the time that we were doing good things for people, and that also Tom was very good for business. After all, he was a small businessman. He was very active in the JCs, which were young business leaders primarily.
So you had that was one of the things that maybe was an asset for him as a campaigner, was that his business catered, his advertising business catered to working with business. So he had a comfortability with the business community, which is probably an asset when you're...
Very much so.
And he was a progressive Democrat, without question.
Without question.
He was strongly pro-labor.
Very pro-labor.
He was pro-women's rights.
Pro-education.
Oh, very much so.
Pro-education, big time,
very much so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that stuff that, well, so all of a sudden we run into the general election. So he defeats these folks by a lot.
I know, amazing.
By a lot. And suddenly he's running against a gentleman out of Great Falls named Tom Selstad,
Yes.
who had been also a state senator. Is that correct?
And a legislator, yes.
And do you remember anything about that, or was it just one of those years? Remember, because it was such a strong campaign for Forrest against Tim. That was certainly a more dominant campaign. Although they didn't run as a team, do you think Tom was a beneficiary a bit of some of the flow of politics at that time?
I think he was, but I think it worked both ways.
Right.
I think those many people that got involved and interested in Tom's campaign also became at least somewhat interested in Forrest.
And he did
Because
have
even
his
though they
own
weren't a
group.
team, they were going to be serving together.
Yeah, and he did have his own group of people.
Definitely.
And so 1968 happens, we have a lieutenant governor, undoubtedly the youngest lieutenant governor, because he would have
Yes.
been at that point 34 years old as a lieutenant governor from Montana. Pretty phenomenal. So the role of lieutenant governor was different than it is today.
Very.
The lieutenant governor at that time served, most prominent thing the lieutenant governor did was to be the president of the Senate
Presided
during the
over the
legislature.
Senate.
And then when they were not in session, there really was not a role for a lieutenant governor.
Not a role at all.
You know, but when the governor left the state, interesting stories about that. If you go back to the time of W.A. Clark, the Copper King, when the governor left the state to California one time, that's when the lieutenant governor reappointed Clark to the Senate, when they tried to sneak him in the back door again, one of the 5 times he tried to get in the Senate. Now, your involvement with that was not quite so colorful, but tell us about the first time that the Governor Anderson left the state and Lieutenant Governor Judge was in charge of the state.
Because in those days, the minute the governor set foot out of the state, the lieutenant governor had to assume the role as
Full
governor.
authority.
So the governor was gone maybe to a governor's conference or something. It was early in Governor Anderson's administration. And so Tom was to be governor for several days or a week, for all I remember. But we were as thrilled as though he had been anointed king of the world. And so several of us, his secretary from the Senate, who had worked for him for quite a while, and I and several others came up to the governor's office. We brought champagne. We went into the office. We hooted and hollered. I heard from Jean Handel, who had been Governor Anderson's executive secretary and then Tom's, that she was very unhappy. We made a mess of the office. We spilled champagne on the desk. And then the next thing you know, somehow Walter Marshall came in to congratulate Tom.
A very infamous figure, if you will, or a colorful figure. That's a good way to put it, yes.
And he said, first of all, he summoned somebody from the highway department to take pictures. And then he said, well, Tom, I have just found out that Chet Huntley is going to open a big ski area down at outside of Bozeman at Big Sky. He said, why don't I call NBC and see if I can't just get him on the phone. Walter could bulldoze his way through anybody. So the next thing you know, he was on the phone at NBC and telling them the Montana governor wanted to speak with Chet Huntley. Next thing you know, Chet Huntley was on the telephone. And they had a very cordial and warm and pleasant chat. And that was when we first found out what Chet Huntley was planning for all of us back here in Montana.
Yeah. For Tom Judge, who was the governor
that
day, you know, he was the governor. It was an interesting thing. Now, an interesting contrast is, because that was nothing substantive happened there other than a lot of good talk, was a contrast with what happened, and I think we spoke about this in an earlier program, that when Ted James and Tim Babcock were governor, lieutenant governor of the same party, they didn't like each other because one was progressive and the other one wasn't. And so when Governor Babcock left the state one time, Ted James was in charge, and there was a vacancy in the Public Service Commission. And while the governor was out of state, Ted James appointed his friend Ernie Steele to the PSC. And it was a done deal.
It was
Boom.
a done deal, and people weren't very happy about it.
They ended up running against each other, and Babcock won the 68 primary. which is why Tom Selstad was running for that seat instead of Ted James. Okay, so now we're going to be moving a little bit to talking about the evolution toward the 1972. And Kent, you came on board at the beginning of the 72 campaign. You had come over here from Missoula, a newcomer to Montana actually, although you had some roots in Montana. And
my wife was born and raised in Missoula.
yeah, yeah, and you ended up going to work for then Land Commissioner Ted Schwinden in 1971. Is that
Correct.
right? And you got to be tying into one of our other thematic things we talked about, you became the person on his staff who was helping to do some of the implementation of executive reorganization, were you?
Correct.
Yeah. And then how did you end up suddenly being with Lieutenant Governor Judge in a campaign? How did that?
Well, pretty strange set of circumstances. My brother-in-law at the time was Bill Cunningham, and he had interviewed with Ted Schwinden for a position in the mine land reclamation area. He had been offered the position but turned it down. I had just returned, we had just come back to Montana. I had just finished graduate school at Utah, and Kathy, my wife, was going to be teaching in Missoula. So we had just come back when I was introduced to Tom Judge by a close friend of Kathy's, Charlene Frogen in Missoula. At the time, I said, I saw him as a very attractive, young, idealistic politician, and I told him that I'd maybe someday like to work for him. And he said, well, that's interesting, but I haven't even decided what I'm running for. So, so in any case, time went on, and I was offered the position by Governor Schwinden
Then Land Commissioner.
as then Lands Commissioner, State Lands Commissioner, and I accepted the position. And so Kathy and I then moved immediately to Helena, where we made a career in state government for 10 years while Kathy taught at the Florence Crittenden Home.
And you were working with Land Commissioner Schwinden, and suddenly an opening kind of cropped up for working in the camp when Tom was decided to run for governor. Is that you said, well, maybe there's something here I should be doing?
Well, yes, sort of. I kind of imposed myself on the campaign at that time.
You wanted to go to work for him?
I did.
Okay.
And so I was one of those people that stuffed envelopes and licked them and stamped them and
So you're the chief envelope stuffer for a
at
while.
that time.
Working for the phenomenal salary of
Zero.
zero.
Correct.
Okay, okay. Good thing Kathy was working, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it never would have happened.
Yeah, yeah. So you're doing that, and then, but you became a very close confidant of the governor. Tell us how that happened.
Well, as a matter of fact, Sidney's husband at the time, Toby Armstrong, was driving Tom to various meetings and conventions, whatever, around the state, but on a very sporadic basis because he had a full-time job.
A real job, yeah.
A real job.
And 4 children.
Yeah, and 4 children. Yeah.
And a wife, yes.
But you didn't live in his shoe, though.
No.
So one time, Toby couldn't do the duty, and so Tom's mother, Blanche, who was sort of running the show at that time, asked me if I knew how to drive. and would I mind driving Tom to this meeting someplace, probably Dillon or someplace like that. And so I did, and from that time on, I became the full-time aide, advanced person, driver. You know, I didn't lick many envelopes after that.
You know, I don't think people always realize, but how important when you have windshield time with a candidate, the relationship that is developed, the trusting relationship that is developed, it has to. If the candidate can't trust the person driving that car with them, sitting there talking with them, listening to everything, knowing everything that's going on, it isn't going to work. So you clearly had established a trusting relationship with him that carried forward. Now that was a primary election that was kind of interesting because as Lieutenant Governor Tom had filed, and the primary opposition to him during that Democratic primary, remembering the primary was in June of 1972, was Dick DeZevi. And Dick had been the president, or the majority leader of the Senate in the 1971 session.
Correct.
The session which was the big battle over the sales tax. And so they'd held a 60-day regular session and had not resolved the issue, and then they had a 19-day special session and still hadn't resolved the issue. Then a 27-day second special session, and they were getting almost close to the beginning of the fiscal year in 1971, and they
hadn't passed a budget.
They hadn't passed the budget because they couldn't get the money thing figured out, and they finally resolved it in June and put sales tax on the ballot. So Dick DeZevi had effectively been the roadblock to stop the sales tax from happening. So he carried that forward with him and decided, I think I should run for governor as well. And so that was the primary race, wasn't it?
Correct.
And how did that play out as time?
Well, Tom had decided earlier that he was going to run. Mr. DeZevi didn't decide until, say, 2 or 3 months after that he was also going to throw his hat in the ring. So we had a head start, and that's when we began putting in at least 16-hour days on the road, traveling to every town in Montana at least once, and just beating every door down that we could to shake hands with everybody that he could possibly come in contact with.
Tell me, what type of campaigner was he?
He was absolutely tireless. I don't know that there's ever been a campaigner in Montana that was as energetic, as thorough as he was. He wouldn't leave anyone's hand unshaken if he could help it. I remember driving down this city street and hear a group of people on the sidewalk, and he'd say, "Stop, pull over." And he'd jump out and go introduce himself to these people.
So were you up at 6 in the morning doing this stuff?
We were up at least at 6 in the morning, and most nights we weren't able to get back to our room until midnight or later. So extremely long days, very, very tiring. I remember, if you'll allow me, we're campaigning in Butte down in the Dry in the pit.
The Dry is the place where when the workers go to work and the workers that come off shift, they kind of cross paths in the Dry, which is where they clean up or they change to their street clothes.
They take off their wet clothes,
right,
hang them up to dry,
right,
and put on their street clothes and get up and out of there.
So you're in the Dry.
So we're there while they're changing all their clothes, going around shaking hands. And it was probably midnight or later, and we'd been going since early that morning. I remember being so tired, I actually laid down on the concrete in the Dry and tried to go to sleep.
Well, you needed to drive.
Yeah, but I still had to drive.
Yeah, so he was, now he was very well known for the last shift of bowling at bowling alleys. Was that a favorite place for him to go?
Yes, it was, because understand that we were at the plant gates at 5 in the morning, shaking hands with everybody coming on shift and going on. So unfortunately, you can't do that today because there aren't any plants still open. So, but in those days, there were still a lot of plants operating in Montana, and we were always there. So that was early morning, and then during the day there were all kinds of meetings, and then in the evening you always went where the people were, and the people were always late at night in a bowling alley or a lounge, restaurant combination, whatever.
So through this primary, Tom is energetically moving forth. Was he using and was he working with the JCs still an awful lot at that
Yes.
time? Did he have the relationships
Yes.
out there?
As a matter of fact, most of the young people that we ran into during those days were connected either with JCs or university, college, all kinds of young people were wanting to get involved. And that's the reason I became involved myself in the beginning, was because of the attitude and idealism that I sensed in Tom.
Well, it's worth noting that by 1972, if you were born in 1946 as a baby boomer, you were 26 years old. So you were just starting to say, I want to be active and involved. So this was the period, this was the baby boomers were starting to first be heard as new voters, but there was a cadre of young business people, young energetic people that had already kind of been making their way in the world.
Right, right. And Tom was a favorite of theirs. Later on, when you talk about his general election opponent, that will become very obvious.
Now
Contrast.
Yes.
he won again by a surprisingly large amount
In the primary.
in the primary. And in fact, let me just take a look at that and see what we have here. Yeah, in the 1972 primary, he got 60% of the vote. 60%, and Dick DeZevi got 30%. So it was a 2-to-1 victory. And now it's interesting because I think there were some parallels. I think we were talking about this before. Some parallels between Forrest Anderson running in the Democratic primary in 1968 against Eugene Mahoney, who had fought back the sales tax as a legislator and was kind of the darling of those folks. And yet Forrest, legislators won in one district or one county, and Forrest had run statewide. And so while everyone got all excited about Gene Mahoney fighting the sales tax, I mean, lo and behold, Forrest overwhelmed him. And here you have another case where DeZevi's claim to fame was fighting the sales tax in the legislature from one county, and lo and behold, another fellow, Tom, who was not only energetic but had run statewide successfully.
Yeah.
Suddenly, that's a little politics. That's not policy driven, but I think there may be some reality to that. Now, all of a sudden, the primary years, now there was a Republican primary of some interest because a gentleman that we had spoken about in previous programs who had such significant differences with Forrest Anderson by the name of Frank Dunkel, the former Fish and Game director, was running in the Republican primary. And many people thought, here's the guy that's going to win the Republican primary. Larry,
Exactly.
you were helping out in the 72 primary from your position in Bozeman at that time, not as campaign manager. Tell us what you were doing at that point.
I was head of the political science program at MSU at the time. My wife had forced the issue and made me move back to Montana ahead of my schedule. We came back in '69. Tom asked me if I would put together his Gallatin County campaign group for the primary. I decided to aim for the general election and put together an organization that was bipartisan. And so in addition to getting key Democrats, preempting them before DeZevi got there, I also looked at these young professional and business nominal Republicans who weren't really in politics, the kinds of people that he knew through the JCs, but also through his other his clients, the accountants, the architects, a variety of people like that. And we put together a very strong who's who kind of campaign committee for Judge in Gallatin County. He won the primary with 70% of the vote in
Down
Gallatin.
there, yeah.
Afterwards, he called me and asked if I would come over and be his campaign manager for the general election. So I took a leave of absence from MSU and came to Helena. there was one glitch right on. The first day I walked, he was out of town, and the first day I walked into the office to assume my duties, his mother was there, and she wasn't going to relinquish that title.
She was not aware of this transition.
Well, either he hadn't had the courage to tell her, or she knew but was going to nip it in the bud. So I walk in, and instead of saying hello,
it's always interesting to note that within all these big picture things, there's a human dynamic.
Absolutely.
Right. And this is one we don't need to go into here, because I go into it in my book, and people can read it. But as I walked in, and this is all I'll say about it, she, instead of saying hello, she said, well, here's what I want you to do. You can research all the education issues. And I said, well, I think you don't understand. So he had to straighten that out when he got back. But we felt quite fortunate that Ed Smith won the Republican nomination and that we had him to run against, because Frank Dunkel was the kind of person who attracted the same sorts of people as Tom Judge. And a lot of the nominal Republicans we got behind Judge might have gone with Dunkel had Dunkel been the Republican nominee. But we were, and this was a time, as Sidney and you and Kent were discussing earlier, of great change, great movements coming, some not perceptible yet, throughout the country. A great progressive era, a time when Democrats were strong and when Democratic issues were at the forefront. And even in Montana, that was true, and we were fortunate to be running against kind of the stereotypical old line Republican, a sheep rancher from Dagmar, who was against everything, against government. Pretty easy. And then when they started making Tom Judge glib and slick and all of this sort of thing that they thought Montanans would recoil at, they also brought in a couple of Californians to run their campaign. So we were able to use that. That just took the wind out of their claim to being real Montanans and down to earth, and their suggestion that maybe Tom wasn't. And
I was executive director of the Democratic
Democratic
then
Party.
It was called executive secretary of the Democratic Party, and we worked together, and you were the campaign manager for Tom.
Right.
And Britt was running the campaign as much as you could for Lee.
Right.
And between you and Britt and myself, we kind of had a little triangle of communication that was very important.
Very advanced for the time.
Yeah. Describe that.
We had 2 telephones on each desk.
Yeah, we each had hotlines to each other.
Yeah.
You know,
and that was fun. And but many times I would be in the back. I moved my office in the back and had the staff in the front building, and I just had a very long table with all these telephones on it, and I would be walking up and down and taking different calls or placing different calls. It was an exciting campaign, and I felt all along we were going to win. But Tom, one reason he's so good at it is he always thinks he's going to lose, and so he doesn't ever let up.
Well, he was a follower of Lee Metcalf, who always says, you know, run scared or run second.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, but we all worked very hard, and we had a great time. We became great friends, and had wonderful celebrations after winning. But it was a pretty, it was a hard-fought campaign, and
well, I think we have to recognize that year was the year that McGovern ran against Nixon.
Right.
So you had the top of the ticket. Huge win for Nixon.
Yes.
I mean, he won by 20% over George McGovern, and to win the governorship against that tide, so to speak, required an awful lot.
A lot of split tickets.
Yeah.
An awful lot of split tickets. Yeah.
Right. But Evan, I think it's important to point out here that even though Tom was running as a Democrat at the top of the ticket, we had many, many friends across the aisle, and that will become more evident as you further explore his actual governorship.
Yeah. Back in the days when that was not uncommon, you know, people
were a little less doctrinaire. Now Ed Smith, and he was known as Big Ed Smith because he was a big guy.
Very
he
big.
was what's he about 6'6" or something.
Yeah,
right.
Really
and
big rawbone guy.
big rawbone state senator from out there. And yet the contrast was extraordinary. You guys, we talked before about how Forrest had come up with some key words to run on in Pay More What For, and there perhaps is no better memorable slogan than that, but you guys sat around and came up with something that drew some comparisons and contrasts and was simple words that describe why Tom Judge.
We came up with ability you can trust, which pretty much distinguished Tom from Ed Smith in terms of the word ability, and then trust. He's not a slicker or that sort of thing.
I think they were painting him as a slickster.
Yes, yes.
And so the trust word was very important.
I believe the Californians tried to do that.
But the Californians tried to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I remember a bumper sticker when those Californians were here. Do you remember what that was?
Don't Californicate Montana.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had nothing to do with it.
Well, you know, there's something to be said for the fact that, you know, Montana, we take our Montanishness very seriously.
To an extreme sometimes.
So tell us, can you tell us about the campaign a little bit more? Was there anything that stands out in this thing, or in terms of, were there debates in those days?
No, I don't recall any debates.
I don't either.
Which is too bad. It would have really been interesting.
Contrast would have become extremely clear.
But no, I don't think there were debates. Tom was on the road a lot.
On the road
with
Kent.
Always. And he, at one point, finally got one of those old-style big telephones in the car. And he would call me as he was returning to town, and we'd compare notes. And but sometimes he'd forget that there was no security. You know, and he'd start saying things that you didn't want anyone to hear other than the person you're saying them to. And I kind of had to gently remind him that, look, all kinds of people could be listening in. Let's talk about that when we get back. But at least he had that phone, and that helped a lot. And we worked pretty long, hard hours. We put together a good young staff. We had old seasoned people as advisors and people who were friends, Tom's and colleagues.
A lot of business people.
Yeah. But the people in the office working in campaign headquarters were essentially young people. Sidney and I were even young then. We were 36, I think, when, or younger.
Blake Wardell.
Yeah.
Kathy Schillinger.
Cale Jackson.
Yeah,
a lot of them. And Tom Behan.
Gary Curtis.
Curtis.
Lots of them.
Yeah. Good, talented, committed kids. Some of them, sleeping wherever they could throw down a sleeping bag at night, and really sacrificing a lot to do this.
Now, was Carol had a couple young children at that time, but
she did have young children.
Did she get out and do a few things with
She
you?
did, as I was mentioning. She and I would sometimes go out for the day, et cetera, et cetera. But we also did some campaigning, and Tom would often meet us somewhere. There would be perhaps a Democratic event in the evening. We would go during the day, and somebody dreamed up that we would have a sound truck. Probably nobody even heard of it in these days. But it was a truck, and there was a man who had a loudspeaker, and he would go down the street saying that Tom was coming and come to the fundraiser that night or whatever. At the same time, Laugh-In, if you recall, Sammy Davis Jr. did a skit where it was, "Here come to Judge."
That was from
Here
Laugh-In,
come to Judge.
right?
Didn't I say Laugh-In?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah.
That's exactly who it was.
Sammy Davis Jr. was the judge in Laugh-In on that little skit
Exactly.
they used to do.
So it was
Here
here
Come
come.
the Judge.
So people started saying that, and we adopted that. And so our sound truck man would say, "Here come to Judge. Here come to Judge. Here come Tom Judge for governor." Then we would sing. People had guitars. These were all volunteers, mind you. We would sing in the Union Hall. We would sing on the street corners. We would have Tom meeting people. We'd be helping register voters, et cetera, et cetera. Then we'd go to the event that night. And then if there were a plant going on or something, we'd go there. We'd stop at cafes, bars, or whatever all the way home. and get home about 2 in the morning. But again, Carol was warm and wonderful and friendly, and people loved seeing her. And we just had an awful lot of fun, feeling as though we were doing things that were going to truly make a difference in the world and for the state.
And so this year, this particular year, 1972, with difficulty at the top of the ticket, with Nixon clearly winning overwhelmingly with a 20% win, and yet Lee Metcalf won re-election. John Melcher in the Eastern District won re-election. Now, it turned out that Dick Shoup stayed on and was only good for 2 more years on the Western District. Tom won for governor. Bill Christensen won for lieutenant governor.
Right.
Was there much of a linkage there? They ran separately, but was there comfortability there with those?
I can answer that, Ellen.
Kent knows.
We campaigned virtually nonstop together. Wherever we went, it seemed like Bill and his aide was there also. So I don't remember really being at any Democratic gathering anywhere in the state that they weren't also there.
Now, Bill was a real gentleman, wasn't
Correct.
he?
Yes, he was.
He was a car
Correct.
dealer from Hardin
Right.
and had been in the state legislature,
Correct.
very well respected.
Very highly respected.
He was the last person elected lieutenant governor
Independently.
independent of the governor.
Correct.
And during the first term they were in is when the Constitution changed and the whole methodology changed.
Right.
Yeah. But think of that, Bill Christensen, Tom, Melcher, Lee, so the Democrats did pretty well, but I think it spoke to the issues. But can you, we got to be pretty quick on this, but do you remember that the fact the sales tax had been crushed so badly the year before and the
3 to
Republicans
1.
were associated with it?
Right.
Did that have any staying power when it came to this election?
It did. It did. But the new Constitution, which was coming up, was also a very critical issue during the campaign, and we campaigned extremely hard statewide for the passage of that new Constitution.
And we tell that story in a number of things. Now we're going to be having to wrap up this. Again, we're talking about the front end of a rather remarkable governorship of the youngest governor of Montana, who spent 8 years in the governorship, and we're going to talk in subsequent programs about what he actually did of substance. But when the election was over and there had to be a move-in, I understand that it had to be a volunteer crew to move the governor in because they didn't have any money to.
It was a volunteer crew, and Tom had, kept some contracts, I think, through his ad agency, but he hadn't been making a lot of money. He had a high school friend associated with Mayflower who was able to get a great big Mayflower moving van, and we got some boxes and so on, came over on a Saturday. We packed up all the things in their house. Now, they didn't need to move the furniture.
But when you got there, and we're going to have to wrap up,
Oh,
I want
okay.
you to tell us a little story about what Tom said the first night in the mansion.
First night in the mansion, we're all dressed in grubby clothes, et cetera, et cetera. We're hot, we're dirty, we're tired, and Carol's family has brought in, bless them, big buckets of fried chicken and French fried potatoes and so on. And we're downstairs in that big rec room at the mansion, and we're talking. And Tom Judge, we're all saying, this is so amazing, we don't believe it. And Tom Judge turned to me and he said, I want to be the kind of governor that Lee Metcalf is as a senator. I want to do what's right because it's right, not because it's going to win me votes. And that was a beautiful way to end that evening and to start his administration.
And in subsequent programs, we're going to discuss how his governorship addressed and approached everything like that. Larry Pettit, Sidney Armstrong, Ken Kleinkopf. Thank you all for joining us in the crucible of change. This is a remarkable starting story to an amazing governorship that we're going to talk about in subsequent programs.
Thank you, Evan.
We'll see
Thank
you
you,
again
Evan.
later.
Good.